So, as we said, this kind of session is on Power BI DevOps for enterprise projects. What do I mean by enterprise projects? The type of project where you're not going straight into production, right? So I've kind of been around the database sector for a long time. You know, I've done all the certifications. I work for Microsoft. But I guess what is kind of relevant is that nowadays I spend my time helping teams implement enterprise data warehouse projects with Power BI, with generally Power BI on top of that. So this talk is about how I've helped our teams establish like frameworks and rules for different types of deployment patterns for different types of customers. So that's really where this talk sort of comes from, okay? Now on the agenda, this is what we're going to go through. A quick touch on kind of source code. I hope that most people know the sort of basics of source code, right? And I go through what I mean by a sample deployment topology or environment. And then I'm going to go through 4 different techniques for deploying Power BI, right? So these are 4 techniques, and we've pretty much used them all on different customer sites, right? So I wouldn't say that we use one sort of method for all our projects, because projects are different sizes, right? And customers are at different types of maturity levels and stuff like that. So there's no one way of doing it. I know that for sure, right? So that's what we're going to talk about. Let's start off source code. So it's quite hard. I'd usually do like a show of hands of, you know, who's familiar with actually Git and stuff like that. But so I'll assume that most people are familiar with the basics of Git, but one of the first things that we pretty much always establish is to try and get source code up for our Power BI projects that we're working on. Now, one thing to be clear on is there's a big difference between self-service and enterprise projects, right? A lot of our projects are self-service. So what that means is we might have a BI consultant who's sitting next to the person who's using it. And as we're making it up, we're deploying and they're coming up with sort of changes. We have no source control in that environment, right? It's straight into a workspace, could even be straight into their kind of my workspace, right? I wouldn't call that an enterprise project, that kind of, you know, making up a report for someone. I'm more talking about the other projects where we're working for, you know, a multi-billion euro, multi-country company, and we're producing something like a profit loss and a balance sheet that has to be deployed to a team of a few hundred accountants across multiple countries. So any changes have got to be rigorously approved by some people in the finance team, say, and perhaps the numbers have to be audited. So there might be different sort of data environments. In that type of environment, we're definitely going to put the PBIX in source control. And what that gives us is versioning. If we make a mistake, we can roll back. And if we've got multiple developers, you know, one person can check it in and another one can check it out. Now, obviously, much like analysis services was like, there's only one object with a PBIX file. So 2 developers have difficulty working with the one sort of PBIX at the same time, but one person can check in and another person can take over, say. So having source control helps with that, right? Just to show you how that might work, right? The de facto tool for that is, if I go to my source control here, right, if I go to my Azure DevOps environment, I can create a team project. And within the team project, I'll have these reposes. So these are Git libraries. Well, you can use the older source control, but kind of no one does that, right? There is also GitHub if you want a completely free one, but most of our projects, as we're a Microsoft partner, would be based on the Azure repos. And when you create a team kind of project, it automatically creates a repos that has the same name as the project. So I've created AdventureWorks, and here I get a Git repos called AdventureWorks. Lesson number 1, you never put Power BI documents in the same repos as all your other source code, right? That has like your C# code and your PowerShell libraries and any ADF code. Like, depending on how big your sort of project is, there could be lots and lots of different artifacts. When we first started using it, we just threw everything in the one kind of repos. So what we always do now is we always create a separate repos specifically for Power BI called, and we generally call it Power BI now, right? And in here, I've just got all my PBIXs, right? once you've created that repos, you can clone it to your hard drive. There's lots of tools and IDEs that will clone it for you. There is even a command line interface. So if I fire that up in Visual Studio, it's got a lovely IDE where it'll clone it for you, and it'll create a token to authenticate for you. So you'll have a copy of the source code on your local computer, right? So here it's just, I just hit the clone using kind of Visual Studio, and hopefully, yeah, there we go. It's saying, do you want to clone this to that path? Yes, please. And when you do that, on that path, you will get a C projects, Benchworks, reports, Power BI. I've now got all my Power BI documents here, right? So that's how to get kind of started. It's very easy. All of your developers are in using Git. Now, there's a bit of pain with that, right? Obviously, a lot of BI professionals might not come from a software engineering background, so there's a bit of learning of Git. You can either use the command line for sort of commit and push, or there are various IDEs that have that for you. The biggest complaint is that the Power BI desktop is not yet have any integration. Lots of people have been hammering at the product team, where's our source code integration? It's not there. The other big problem for us is if you read any of the guidelines on Git, they say do not put large objects inside source control. What is a PBIX? It's a large object, right? So that's a bit of a problem. Because it's a multi-version system, it kind of stores all the changes. So if you've got a 1 gig PBIX and you keep on changing it and committing it, your repos gets kind of larger and larger. We had one customer site where the repos grew to about 100 gigabytes. And when one of the pipelines went to deploy like a PowerShell script, it took it like 45 minutes to initialize the kind of library. And we were like, oh, okay, we better do something about that. So that is a problem. And I'm hoping that eventually, you know, maybe 3 to 10 years time, Microsoft might come up with a solution to that. Like, can we have a way of not storing the actual sort of data inside the PBIX, a bit like we do in analysis services, as a separate file, so that when the source code gets checked in, it doesn't include that file, right? Anyway, one of the problems of using Git is you can't merge very well, right? So say, for example, you make a change, or I make a change, and maybe Mark makes the change, and we both sort of sync at the same time, it will attempt to do a merge, which just is never going to work, right? Because it's only a single object, it'll corrupt it every time. I did have a lovely video whenever I chat about how Git merge works with analysis services or Power BI. I have no idea if this video is going to work on this, but I'll play it anyway, just to see. This is the internals Git merge. You kind of get the point, is that it doesn't work. So the last person to commit basically has the option of overwriting the files and stuff like that. So you have to be very careful about how you manage Git. But the key concept is get your files into source control. Now, looking at a deployment environment, one of our customers could look like this. So we might have a dev, test, and a prod environment. There might be 3 separate data warehouses with different sets of data in that. Development environment might have some production and some test kind of data in it, right? Test might have a specific set of environments. Say, for example, we do a lot of ERP work. So they might have test scenarios that they're actually putting through there, and it'll have a specific set of data. And the key thing is that when we publish the PBIX, we want it to link in each environment to different sets of kind of data. We might have a hybrid environment where the actual data warehouse is in a VM or on-premise, in which case the gateway has to also be configured. Or it could be a cloud-based environment where the PBIX can natively speak. So if it's a SQL DB or a SQL data warehouse, it might natively be able to speak to it. So here's, I'm assuming that there's 3 environments. One of the big kind of lessons I've learned though is don't go in with what I call the enterprise stick, because, you know, it's saying we must have dev, test, and prod. because you could be working for one where it's the same guy who's testing is the same guy who's going to be using in production, or where the development team's kind of doing the kind of testing as well, in which case merging those environments can save a lot of money and can make it a bit more agile as well, right? But this is fairly standard for larger projects, right? So what we need is a way to move the PBIX between environments without written instructions on a post-it note and developers them to manually do stuff, right? So I'm going to look at 4 different ways of doing that, right? Now, the first most basic way, so when you're like, well, I don't want to release this straight to production, I want to have a little check before I release it into production. The most cheapest way of doing that is by making use of an app, right? So I'm hoping that most people are familiar with the concept of an app. So an app sits on top of a workspace and it lets you manage the information in, but saying, well, I'll include these reports in this order. So you can create like an index of the reports and you can advertise that app to different users so it appears on their workspace, right? So if you've made a change, you effectively publish the change to the workspace, but the end user doesn't see that change. So you can then test it, or the tester can sort of test it, approve it, and then you hit the update app button and it gets flushed to the app, and then it's available for all of the users to consume. So very, very lightweight. Just to show you that, here I've got a PBIX that has finance reports in it. So I've got a profit and loss, a balance sheet, and a cash flow. Okay, so say for example I've made a change, right? Let's put a comment on that so we can see that. So I've made this change and I want to flash this change through, so I can hit published and I can save it to my workspace. I'm going to save that to my workspace. And when I'm in my workspace, I can create an app, or I might already have an app. So here's one that's already got an app, and I can approve the changes. So I can go in, now I haven't actually deployed those changes here, but I can have a look at the report, kind of make sure I'm happy with the content of the report. And once if it's a financial report, they might kind of look at the numbers and stuff and kind of check they're all okay, right? And once they're happy with the content of the report, they can then hit the update app button, and it will be deployed to the application workspace for the end users to consume, right? So just while that's warming up, I can go into the workspace and let's go workspaces in there. This is update app button. This will then take the changes, deploy them to the application. So it's a lightweight form of ALM, right? A lot of limitations. So let's have a chat about what that's good for and what that's not good for, right? Very simple, very lightweight, and it allows you to prove what I call UI changes, you know. Also, the app hides a lot of the complexities of workspace. It's a simplified way for end users. So especially if you've got hundreds of users, it's a good way to package up all your reports, right? On the bad side, you know, there's still only one data model. So the app's got a linked data set. So there's only one kind of data set. So if you've made model changes like, you know, new columns and stuff like that, it's not going to work so well. And if you want to be linking into different environments, they're like, well, I want to test it on a test set of data first. It's obviously not going to do that. There's no versioning of rollback. So if you do a deployment and you're like, whoops, okay, I want to roll that back, you're going to want to have kept a backup of the PBIX or something like that. It's got to be manual. You know, it's not going to help that for you. There's no workflow as in getting someone to approve it or anything like that. And you don't really know what you're deploying as well. It doesn't say, well, this has changed and that's changed, you know. So it's very limiting. So let's look at the next shirt size up, right? So yeah, it's certainly a next kind of step up, but it's not the be all to end all really, right? Now, this is a very interesting runner. So entered preview March 2020 and RTM, I think September 2020 is the Power BI product team's first pass of deployment pipelines, right? So if you are a premium kind of user, and only if you're a premium user, this will appear in your Power BI there, deployment pipelines, right? Rather than talk about it, it's probably better to show you a demo of it, right? So let's go into my Power BI environment, and I can now click on deployment pipelines, and here's a deployment pipeline. So what you do is you register a dev, test, and a prod, okay? And these, it creates actual workspaces for you, okay? Notice the little kind of premium kind of symbol. It's sort of giving you a hint, you know, they've got to all be sort of premium. And what it allows you to do is a few things. One feature that I absolutely love is it tells you, it does a comparison as you load it between environments, and it tells you if they're in sync. So the green arrow means, yep, these are in sync, right? So let's actually take that change, and I'm going to deploy that to the development workspace, which I think was called AdventureWorks Dev, right? It'll take a few minutes to, well, hopefully won't take it too long to deploy. So while that's deploying, let's flip back and have a look at the features, right? When I deploy to test, I can configure these things called rules that let me overwrite the connection string, okay? So I can say, if the connection string is set to the dev server, replace that string with the test server and stuff like that, right? So I can define these kind of rules. The screen's going a bit slow there. And I can do the same for production as well. I can configure the different security on test versus that, and it reapply all of the security for me. And at the push of button, I can refresh any of the data sets, and I can see all of the kind of data sets contained within there. Let's just see if this has finished uploading. Hopefully it's finished uploading. Yes. Oh, publishing.
Bob, whilst it's uploading, can you just clarify whether the deployment pipelines are also exist for premium by user workspaces?
They definitely exist for by user, because I am using a by user workspace. I was too cheap to buy the full one. There is a couple of limitations that I noticed though, right? One limitation I noticed is, for example, if you're using by user, I haven't found a way to get a service principal to authenticate. So if you want to automate and use a service principal for normal Power BI, you can create a special app ID in Azure Active Directory that does not need a Power BI Pro license, and it can have the rights to deploy files and do stuff, right? When I tried that with my Power BI user, and only I had a per user, it came up with an unauthorized error message. And I meant to contact Microsoft to say, is there a workaround? I came to the conclusion that I couldn't see how service principals could work on the per user. So apart from that, this is all per user. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. So let's just refresh the screen now that that's updated. I'm going to push F5, and hopefully you will now see, look, it says, hey, look, synced out of sync. And it's telling me the report is slightly different. Did you see this here? It's saying, look, this report is different than there. Now, it won't do an advanced comparison to actually tell you what lines on the report. I think the SQL BI guys have actually got an app called ALM for Power BI that actually does compare to, but at least it tells you exactly what files are different. So I can see the kind of data model is the same, the report is different. And when I hit deploy to test, it will push the ones that have changed to test, and it'll also change the connection string as well. So it's now going to point to the test environment. And now, as you see, test is different than prod. So I can click compare, and it's like, hey, this one is a different. What I also found was quite handy is if a developer threw something into prod without me kind of knowing about it, it told me that there's an extra file in here, and it gave me the option to delete the file that's kind of not approved, like it's not part of the set of files, right? So I can deploy that to production.
So do you know if this deployment takes the deployment, for instance, the dev to test deployment, does it take the binary file from dev and deploys to test, or does it take the same checked-in version in the DevOps repository?
It goes from dev to test and then test to prod.
So it's only the first in the chain that takes the repository version?
Yes. So if you've got a collaborative branch, so depending how you, so there's two ways that people typically do the kind of source control, right? One is you have like a collaborative branch, like main or master, right? And you could be, if you either work directly in that, if it's a small project, or you have a feature branch that you're working in, and you check into this sort of collaborative branch after it's ready, and then you might deploy from there. Now, one thing to bear in mind on this, there's no vehicle that Microsoft have to move from source code to the dev branch, right? So you've either got to write that script yourself or manually go in and hit the sort of publish button, right? So it's not a requirement to have any source control in order to use these pipelines here. Now, obviously that would be something that I would hope that kind of Microsoft are working on, is tighter source control integration. But just because this feature doesn't have source control in that integration doesn't mean that you can't use kind of source control, obviously, right? The other approach that people might do is they might have a publish branch, right? So after they're ready to deploy, they effectively promote it up to a publish branch, take it out there and stick it into kind of dev. Either option will work fine, but it does go dev to test and test to prod. So that's it. You can update the app, but you have to hit the button. It's not, there's actually no API that I found to update an app. And if you look at all the APIs and all the REST calls, there's no REST calls to update an app, which is really annoying, right? But you can manually click update there. Okay. So
we have a couple of questions as well from the Q&A.
Yeah.
One is, service principal not working for PPU is by design.
I thought as
no
much.
Clue.
And as kind of someone actually commented, and as I found out, the service principal doesn't work yet on the PPU. So if you want to automate, you would have to use what we call a master services account, like an actual user, and you'd have to assign them a PPU license as well.
Okay, so that was just asking that question, and we had a one from Nico as well, and that is, can normal Power BI Pro users access the pipeline workspace, like with the workaround you said right now with a master account? Would that work?
Good question. Good question. Can a pro user access a premium account? I have customers who are either premium or pro. I haven't yet tried that. If we get some time at the end, can we park that? And what I'll do is I'll actually open the web browser as a pro account and try and access the premium account. And certainly I know you won't see the deployment kind of pipelines, right? But whether you can interact with the workspace, I'm not sure. But if we get time at the end, we'll actually give that a crack, right?
Yes, I'll save that for later.
But generally, we don't mix and match yet, pro and premium. Most of our customers are one or the other. And we've only got customers right now. We've just starting off a project that's starting to use the per user, because obviously it's a relatively new concept, right? Okay, so that's that. So yeah, so let's chat about the pros and cons of that, right? So hopefully everyone understands the kind of concept. Only one screen, right? So, it's not, doesn't take long to learn, how it works, right? Things that I liked about it, right? Super easy and initiative, right? If you're not a software engineer who's worked with deployment kind of pipelines before, this is a very easy starter compared to the likes of Azure Pipelines that has its kind of YAML kind of scripting language. This is an absolute doddle, right? And I love the compare feature. Being able to see exactly what files are different is very, very nice, right? So that's good. I absolutely love these little tags here. So have a look at, see that, don't know if you noticed that, but when I go into a workspace, say for example, I go into, now I've just called this actually dev, right? But when I click on it, within Power BI, it actually tags it as a development environment here. So it's now environment aware to say, hey, this workspace is a development environment. And if I go into the test, it's this workspace is test environment. And if I go into here, it says the workspace is a production environment. It doesn't kind of charge me any less, but I really like the fact there's a clear way of understanding without having to feed it into the name of the workspace. So that I think is pretty cool, right? Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at pure ALM and features that I'd want, doesn't have rollback, right? If I do a deployment, I want to be able to say, oh, no, change my mind. I want to go back to a previous version, right? Yeah, I do not like how they do the connection strings. Their connection string is a glorified find and replace. It says, if the connection string equals this, change it to this. But my developers put random connection strings when they upload. So one of my developers could get a PBIX and they could point it at production because they want to see production data in it because they're simulating a production issue that can only be seen on kind of production data. Then they save it and forget to point it back to the development environment, right? So what I'd want is that when they accidentally do that and it deploys it to the development environment, it wipes the string and just puts the development one. It doesn't say, I'm only going to change it if it was this, you know. There's a few of the finer points that it doesn't do. It doesn't bind gateways or deal very well with linked reports. But for binding gateways, you can manually do that once yourself. So just to show what I mean by binding gateways, hopefully everyone's, because it's a hybrid environment, if I go to the data flow and I go to my settings of my data set and to my gateway connection, I'll have an on-premise gateway running, okay? And this will have to be mapped to the gateway. So this is the test environment, so it's mapped to a test. I must have been a bit dyslexic in the spelling of that, right? But that will be blank. It won't work and you will get an error, right? But if you come to it and manually fix it, then future deployments reuse that, right? So it's not that bad. But any ALM that we use, all right, it would obviously do that automatically. Yeah, obviously the premium only. A lot of our large customers are pro wall-to-wall because they've either paid for it 3.5 or they've got a lot of users and you know that's how it works. So telling them to upgrade to premium just for this feature would be a hard sell for us, right? And one of the things I don't like about it is the whole concept. So they wanted to write a pipeline, and there's this product called Azure DevOps Pipeline, which is an award-winning industry standard used for all software development with the most features of any pipeline that I've ever seen. And they said, with God knows how many hundreds of millions of euro invested in it, did they say, should we reuse that or bugger it? Let's go and write our own one. So they decided to write their own one, right? And obviously it's going to have like 1% of the features of the fully fledged kind of product. You know, I understand why they might have written their own ones because otherwise it would need like a DevOps license, right? Which, you know, I would have liked if behind the scenes there was a way that, you know, it wrote a template that could then be used as a starter pack in the fuller product and expanded. And there's a question coming in about tasks to set values based on environment variables. So no, you can't do that in the pipeline, but what you can do is you can do that in the sort of data set itself post deployment. So for example, I'll just show you what I mean by that. In the parameters section here, I can add replacement parameters and stuff like that. So you can do parameter swapping, not as a feature of the pipeline, as a feature of the dataset configuration. And each time a deployment is done, the dataset configuration kind of sticks, right? So it'll remember the mapping, it'll remember the parameters, our data source credentials, our query caching kind of settings and stuff like that. So it has that type of feature. So, you know, that's kind of not bad, right? But on the whole, it's, you know, it was a V1 effort, and it's certainly, I wouldn't call it enterprise enough for the no rollback, release, Git integration, and the full functionality of Azure Pipeline. But good enough for a lot of projects? Yeah, absolutely. And we're planning on using this on some kind of projects now. Obviously, it'd be interesting to see what the next version brings. You know, I'm hoping they get some of those things. So if you're on premium, it's worth a look, right? For absolutely certain. Method 3, this is actually one of our more common methods, PowerShell and REST, right? So one of the things about Power BI is it comes with fantastic REST protocol that you can do most things programmatically, right? I go Power BI REST API, hey, bingo, bong. There's a whole everything, not nearly everything. So I'm going to have this little, when I go to apps, look, get. There's no set, man, there's no set. But other than that, when you're dealing with sort of reports and data sets, there's a ton of functionality and you can automate nearly everything by REST, right? And there's a lovely thing. Say, for example, I want to get a list of data sets. There's a lovely thing where you can hit sort of try it and it will do a sample REST call. So all you're really doing for a REST call, for those who aren't familiar with the REST, is hitting a URL with either a get, if you're just really typing it in, a post if you're passing a parameter in, which is usually JSON, a collection of variables in, okay? Now, the REST is a little bit complex for some people. So what they've done is they've wrapped the REST in PowerShell commandlets, which are super user-friendly, right? So rather than using REST to automate Power BI, the commandlets are much better. And there's a whole set here. There's a whole PowerShell. So you can type install module PowerShell Power BI commandlets. Yeah, that one, and install a load of commandlets that will start to automate things like getting workspace, getting reports, updating workspace, and deploying to add reports, right? Now, one complaint is the guy who wrote these must have been really good, right? Because it's some really good kind of PowerShell work, but I think it was too good. And what happened is he got halfway through taking all of the REST commands and converting them into commandlets, and he did it fantastically. He did it so well that he was given another job before he finished. So half of the commands are REST only, and they never got round to making a commandlet for them, right? And that hasn't changed in years, right? So let's show an example of that, right? So here I've got some PowerShell, right? One complaint about this is I do all my PowerShell code usually in Visual Studio Code, and every now and then a Power BI deployment breaks it from working in Visual Studio Code. And the update I just deployed this morning did exactly that. I don't know why that is. It is a known issue if you Google for that. But here it is in this ID, it's fine. So what I can do is programmatically, I can connect to the Power BI kind of service. And obviously, if I was going to automate this, I'd, there you go. So I can authenticate. Now, if I have a service principal, which as we said, doesn't work on premium, but if it's pro, it will work, I can automate that, right? Or if I have a master service account, right? I then can give it a bunch of parameters. So here's a bunch of parameters. And I've just written a little loop that says find every PBIX in that workspace, okay? So if I do get child, this is going to enumerate all of the PBIXs in that workspace. Okay, I've only got one, right? I'm going to find all the PBIXs. For everyone, new PBI report is one of the commandlets. So I'm like, upload it, right? Overwrite, yes, please, and give me back the unique GUID, right? And when I run that code, I've now automated a deployment. Okay, so we have environments where we just have a PowerShell file that says deploy to test, deploy to prod. Now that's only part of the story because it might have the wrong connection string in it. So there's then another commandlet that gets the data set behind the report. So I can do this, and then I can get the ID of that, and then I can say, tell me the data sources that are inside that. And this is calling a REST method. Now, the good news is, although they didn't wrap them all in commandlets and they left kind of some as very loose kind of RESTs, they did implement this one PowerShell called invoke REST kind of method, which is quite easy to use, right? So now I do that, I've got the data source that's contained within it, Okay, so I can take that data, just show you what that might look like. Let's format that as a list. I can see that I've got a connection string with a server name and a name of a database, and I might want to, as part of the deployment, also change that. So I can build up a JSON string that says find the old server and database, replace it with the new information, and I'm going to pass that JSON to a REST function called update data source. And when I do that, I'm going to update the data source. Boom, done. Right. So now this file that I've just deployed to AW Dev, oh yeah, I should have really showed you it here, right? AW Dev. I've now changed the data source, okay? But notice I don't have a mapped gateway, okay? So if I was to refresh that, I would get an error. So let's just show you that. If I go refresh, yeah, I get an error, right? Because it doesn't know what sort of gateway. So coming back to the code, I don't know if I have the code to set the gateway. Oh yeah, I've got some more code here. This code finds out what gateways are available. So give me a list of the available gateways that could be used. And then this REST file binds it to the gateway. So when I go back to my report now, hopefully, if I refresh this, you should find it's bound to the gateway now. So all of this can all be automated in PowerShell. See, that's now mapped. And now I can refresh that, right? Now, this is fairly, I don't know, it's quite verbose, right? You know, you see like how many lines of kind of PowerShell do I have, right? There's about 100 lines of PowerShell there, right? And that's just for uploading, remapping a data source and rebinding a gateway, right? So I wouldn't want to have like 100 lines of code for something like that. So what we do is we wrote a wrapper for that called PBI tools, which basically reduces the whole of that to a one-line call, right? Now, it is public available, but and you're more than happy to spelunk into it, but it's not a commercial product. So that means it doesn't come with commercial support, right? But if you want to take hold of it and write your own version, you can type install module PBI tools, and you'll have this wrapper library. And what this wrapper library does is it adds intelligence by combining all of those REST functions and commandlets into a single line call. So now our developers just say, new report, here's my path, here's my workspace, and this is the name of the SQL Server I want to bind it to, right? And when we run that, that automatically does the upload, the changing of the data source, the finding of the gateway, the remapping of the gateway. It even has intelligence that if someone else is the owner, it will take over ownership and then change it so it works. And with the same thing for refresh as well. So if I call this, it'll use the API to invoke a refresh. It'll also pipe the PowerShell back into an audit log in a SQL Server, say, right? So I can now see that's now done a refresh by API and logged the results into a data table. So I've now got a process log that I can capture all of the processing that's happened. And if I had an error, it would give me the error message and so forth. Okay, so that's an example of using PowerShell, right?
We have a question about the PowerShell deficiency when mapping the REST APIs. Did they open source it at any time and maybe expected the community to finish it?
Perhaps, yeah. So there's a few theories, right? My theory about this really good guy who got a sort of headhunted is completely made up, right? I have no idea, right? It is the PowerShell commandlets don't know if they're open source. Let's have a look. Like if you go to the PowerShell gallery, you'll be able to see, right? Yeah, so the package is available, but it's I'm not sure it's open source, like it's authored by Microsoft. And it does get changes. Look, like the last change was kind of 2 months ago, but I haven't seen a great cadence in the wrapping of the existing REST. Like we've been using the same REST calls for nearly 2.5 years now, and we haven't been able to replace any of them with commandlets. So, but saying that, it's not the end of the world. I mean, because the PowerShell commandlet to call the REST is this one line here, and the making up of the URL is that kind of line there, right? So, you know, it's it is partly as a community being lazy because they like the kind of wrapping of the command. Yes, there is another project there that Rishi's put, Power, yep, yeah. So I had a look at that one, yep, and I didn't use that one for the exact same reason that you guys probably shouldn't use mine, right? And that's, I found some bugs and stuff in it, and I was too lazy to work with the author to fix them, so I was like, I wrote my own. And I think I wanted to do a few more things like the mapping of gateways, the sort of taking over ownership. So I wanted to kind of make it one sort of button click. So I was thinking, could I use that one or write my own, but ended up, I wrote my own, you know. Anyway, so that's the PowerShell route. And I say you don't have to write your own kind of wrapper library. The base command units and REST are kind of usable as they are, right? Bad points, yeah. I mean, obviously, there's no rollback, and you've got to look at where you're deploying from. So a good point that someone can mention on the first one is, are you going from dev to test and then from test to prod? Because that's probably what you want to do, because when you test something, that's the version that's being kind of tested. Here, you're usually deploying from your computer, right? So if you're deploying from your collaborative branch and you deploy to dev and then you go back to the collaborative branch and deploy to test, and then go back to the collaborative branch and deploy to prod, who's to say that someone didn't kind of mess with it in the meantime, right? So you've now got to look at, do I need to implement some sort of branching or some way of knowing, of understanding that there's no chance of drift having occurred, right? Whereas it's nice if the release takes care of that for you, right? So yeah, and there's no rollback. Like if I push a report by using kind of PowerShell, I can't change my mind after I've done it, right? So the last method is really combining the PowerShell. It doesn't have to use kind of PowerShell. This is the full enterprise. Oh yeah, here's some sample commandlets. So these are the main commandlets that I would use. You know, get a list of workspace, get a list of data sets, get a list of reports, publish a report, and then invoke the REST method for the stuff that actually doesn't have a commandlet. The most common one I'm surprised doesn't have a commandlet is to refresh, or to get the refresh history. That is a REST call, but you know, it's not that complex. Anyway, the full kind of whammy in terms of the gold standard is probably the full Azure pipeline, right? So this is, if you're doing a full stack project and you've got like, you know, other components that are being deployed in an automated fashion, they're probably being deployed by Azure pipelines in a Microsoft project, right? So just reuse that for Power BI. And the beauty of this is it wouldn't need premium, right? Because, you know, it's not a feature of Power BI that you're using, it's a feature of the Azure DevOps, but you obviously have to pay a license for that. Good news is once you have an MSDN, it's going to come with a license anyway, right? So most developers would already have a license for Azure Repos. So I'll jump straight into a demo of that, I suppose, right? When I go to my, so I've got one of the old style ones. If you get a new one, it should be sort of devops.com, but mine was set up so kind of long ago, it's visualstudio.com. I've been too lazy to change it. Anyway, we've been looking at repos here, right? Going down the line, you've got your pipelines, right? And the first thing that you're going to make is a build pipeline, which they called pipelines. And then you're going to make a release pipeline. So the build pipeline is going to take the PBIX out of source control and stick it in a repository so it's ready for a release, okay? And to show you what that looks like, I've got a sample here. So I'm just going to edit the pipeline. Now, I'm using the classic editor. There's also this thing called a YAML editor, a markup editor, where all the commands are sort of typed. Because we kind of set this up ages ago, it's still using the classic one, right? But it's more sort of visual anyway, right? So it's easy to follow, right? So what this does is it gets out of the source control, it does effectively a get latest version or a pull, right? And it's going to do that to a cloud-based agent, right? So it's either a temporary VM, or you might have an infrastructure as a server kind of VM as a build server that has an agent deployed, right? And then you can add, one of the fantastic things about Azure pipelines is the community of Microsoft and third-party plugins, and even there's even people who've written stuff specifically for Power BI to automate things. All these ones here were written by a guy at Microsoft. I don't know if there's actually someone on the Power BI team, but he wrote a lot of them. Some MVPs have written kind of plugins and stuff like that. But all I want to do during the build phase is just take hold of the PBIX and stick it into a drop folder. So I've now got a build number with a stamped, this is what I have. Now, go in the whole stack, I could do some testing as well. Maybe I could sort of publish it into a temporary workspace and then refresh it to make sure it's working. So testing is usually a big part of sort of fuller ALM in the software engineering world, but I'm just really doing it at a very basic level. In triggers, I can make this so for continuous integration. So what I can say is, as soon as a check-in happens or a push, I want you to automatically fire the build and automatically deploy to the build server. Now, I've actually ticked this, although most of our projects, we don't have continuous integration because our releases aren't that fast, right? So a developer would say, no, I want to release now, and hit sort of push a button. You wouldn't expect it to automatically happen as soon as a check-in is done. In fact, that would probably annoy him, right? But just for the purposes of a demo, I've said that. Once you've done the build, you've now got all your sort of PBIXs stored in the cloud, right? And then your release can take that information and deploy it to multiple environments, right? So I can deploy to dev, test, and prod. And I'll just edit the release pipeline. The release pipeline then looks like this. Now I can configure an automated trigger to say continuously deploy. So every time a build happens, I can say, I want you to automatically deploy only to the dev environment, right? I mean, not to prod, I'd hope, right? And then I'm going to leave it there. And then I can add extra environments by cloning them. So this is test and this is prod. And I can then say, well, I'm going to manually deploy to test. As soon as I've deployed to test, and I should probably have some tests, but a lot of Power BI is kind of manual testing where sort of people are eyeballing the report and saying, yeah, that's good. So it's hard to automate tests. But once it's approved, I've then configured some workflow. So I can configure these options that says, I want you to, after test has been deployed, wait for the approval of a manager, and once he's approved it, deploy to prod. Now, it's a fictitious environment, but let's actually walk that through. So I'm in my PBIX, I've typed in my new string, I've clicked save. I now want to put that into source control. Now, I'm too lazy to type in git commands, so I have to say, I often use a Visual Studio Code just for its integration into Git, because what I can do is I can type on this button, added a line to report. I can commit that, and then at the bottom, it shows me how many things is waiting to push, right? So I'm going to go, yeah, push, and that's now going to push it up into the cloud-based kind of repos, right? Now, if the continue integration is running, then what should happen is the build should automatically kick off. My pipelines, yay, look, see, just now. And that's running away. And if I'm really quick, I can actually watch it working. I love just kind of staring at the DOS screens, kind of showing all the commands kind of running. So it's checked out all the code. It's taken the PBIX, it's put it into this artifact kind of library. So this gives me a library, so I know all the different versions. I can I can get those back if I want to see what version was deployed, okay? And once it's finished, the release is then going to automatically start. So let's go over to the release. Now, it'll take a little while. So this should be release 8, right?
Whilst we're waiting on that, Bob, can I ask a couple of questions?
Fire away.
So you've got $1 million and $1 question here from Tiago. So he says, how do you manage conflicts on multiple pull requests? That, I guess, is a session in itself.
Yes. So in the same way that analysis services guys used to for the previous 10 years, and that means badly, right? Yeah. So what we do in my current project is we've actually got a PBX and there's 4 people working on it. What we do is an email generally goes around saying, can I currently have this? I saw one customer where they actually had a toy of a cube, and whichever developer held that is the guy who was allowed push and pull. So it doesn't merge well. So you have to be very good at making sure that everyone checks in. Sometimes what a developer will do on one of our projects is they're working a separate branch or a separate copy of the PBIX, then make all those changes, and say, for example, they're adding a page to a report. Then once they're ready to inject it back into the main one, they'll open up the live one, copy the page out of their in sort of progress, paste it into the live one, and then push. So their pull, paste, push is only a couple of minutes, right? But we don't have a slick way of doing that, right? And one of the annoying things about Git is in the very old days, for those who are familiar with the good old TFS or what was it called? The really old kind of source control.
Visual Source Safe.
That's it. Visual Source Safe and its big brother TFS had a lovely feature called exclusive checkout, where you could say, I'm editing this, no one else can make an edit, right? But obviously Git does not have that, right? So yeah, so it is a problem, and you need a process rather than a technology to solve that. So what you'll see now, anyway, if you look at the screen, release 8 has magically appeared, right? So my dev environment has now magically got the changed version, I'd assume, right? So if I go to my Power BI, now this isn't the premium one, this is the sort of pro one now, right? And hopefully look at the bottom, I've got that new change that was kind of made there, updated for hybrid meet, and that's kind of the change that I did, right? And what I can do now is using the Visual Studio, I can approve that change. I go, right, yeah, okay, I like that, right? And I'm now going to deploy to test, right? So I go into the pipeline, go into the test environment and hit deploy. And that's now going to deploy to that. Now, while that's deploying, I'll show you how I built this actually, I should have done. If I click edit, we always use PowerShell because as you said before, like there's REST and commandlets, and it's very easy to integrate PowerShell into pipelines. But this time I was really lazy, and I actually used one of the wrappers that someone else wrote that effectively calls the PowerShell or the REST for you. So you can go add, and if you really don't like typing PowerShell code, it comes with a drag and drop tool that you only say, I want to upload this report to this workspace, using this service a credential. So here I'm actually using a service principal, which is stored within DevOps, has a way of storing all the service kind of principles for you, right? So that's quite nice. Anyway, let's go back to the pipeline. There's my pipeline. That's now deployed to the test environment. And when I approve that, see, it says kind of waiting on approval. When that's approved, oh, sorry, it's waiting on a deployment queue. When a manager gets an email or whatever and hits approve, it will then automatically deploy to prod, right? So that's how that pipeline. As you can see, it's a lot more sophisticated and extensible than the deployment pipelines that are kind of native, because it's built for everything, right? One nice feature is these dashboards actually. So I can build a dashboard that shows me all my build progress, any tests that have been running, any work items, and what version is deployed to what environment. And what I can also do is, say, for example, so I know that production has actually only got version 28 on it. So if I did deploy version 31 to production and say, oh, no, I want to go back to 28, I can re-go to version 28 and then re-hit the deployment button to redeploy version 28. So that gives me my rollback and stuff like that. That is harder to get with the other ones, right? So that is that. Good points. Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a lot more powerful and extensible. You know, I've only scratched a tiny bit of the functionality of Azure pipelines, right? A proper kind of speaker who's just focusing on Azure pipelines would go to a lot more than that, right? It's got versioning, rollback, Git integration, you know, it's got all the stuff that you kind of look for. Obviously, it's more difficult. It needs that kind of DevOps license. Doesn't really have the compare feature, you know, but other than that.
I've actually tried recently, just now, that if you're in a tiny project with less than 5 developers, you could use the Azure pipeline, the DevOps pipeline for free.
Yes,
because
it
you
comes
get a
with
five user free
Correctly.
users.
Correct. Yeah. And the only other cost is when your build, it spins up a temporary VM type thing in the background and you're paying per compute for that, unless you host your own VM to do the build. But I mean, it doesn't take it that long. So we haven't noticed huge bills for build costs, you know. Okay, I did show you an example of a refresh API as well, which is super useful. For us, the default kind of mechanism of setting a time for the cloud to refresh at never works, right? No, I mean, it works, but it doesn't work for us. And the reason it doesn't work for us is because our systems have so many moving parts that we can't be guaranteed that the same thing happens at the same time every night. So we want our refreshes to be event driven. So as soon as the data warehouse is loaded, we want it to trigger a refresh. We don't want to have to wait to the same window every night. So we always do our refresh via the PowerShell commandlets there. So what do we learn? Yep, there's many ways of doing the deployments. You can overcook or undercook it. Your first shirt size is your workspace going up to an app. Power BI pipelines are a nice starter if you're in the premium space. But if you're not in the premium space, you can use PowerShell and this REST API, or the full kind of whammy, the Azure pipelines for the real enterprise stick as such, right? And obviously we await with kind of bated breath the kind of V2 of the Power BI kind of pipelines. Are they going to have sort of Git integration? Are they going to let you convert over to an Azure pipeline? Are they going to have more extensibility? Are they going to have versioning and rollback? You know, who knows? That's it. I put some links in here and I will supply this deck. So that goes through some of the stuff that we talked about there. And I'll happily answer any Q&A if anyone wants to chat about any of the topics there.
Yes, we have a question from Ruben. Hi, Ruben. They are using the Azure pipeline in production, but incremental deployments. So if you update one PBIX file, the full folder with all the reports gets triggered, uploaded, and deployed. And that kills the cache, impacts users. So could we partition the pipeline or do some intelligent what has changed gets deployed?
Yeah, so that's one of the, cannot be granular enough, right? So that's one of the problems is of pipelines in general is they can be very monolithic, right? So what that means is if you've got 20 sort of PBXs and one of them has changed, it does the whole lot, right? So it's difficult, right? What you could do is obviously create multiple pipelines. So we have done that, like a finance pipeline, and we've split it by verticals. So we don't have one pipeline for the entire customer with one for finance that's 4 or 5 and another one. ultimately what you've got to get is a way to detect that something has changed and from what's in production already, right? Now, I haven't got a full solution for that. I've had some ideas on how you could do it. You'd probably need to include some sort of manifest though to actually tell it what files have changed, and as part of the deployment only do the overwriting and the refreshing for files based on the manifest file. But how to automatically populate that kind of manifest file based on the state of production without downloading the PBIXs, I haven't fully sussed how to do that myself, right?
So you have to build some kind of your own build containment or version control inside the version control.
Yeah, unfortunately, or have smaller pipelines,
Yep.
I will fire a suggestion on that, Bob, and feel free to shoot me down. But so the way around that I would suggest, because your repository is your manifest, you know what's changed within that, and I would potentially configure a kind of a dedicated release branch which would only contain whatever files you want in it to be pushed up. And from so what I would do is, it's not automated as you're saying, but I would then go through the repository and look at the change history, and then cherry pick whatever changes I want to promote, and then create a cherry picked branch, merge that into the release branch, and then that should then push up. So I don't know if that sounds like a complete waffle.
Yeah.
Or
Pretty much you could do like Ruben is suggesting. We could use a git delta so we get the changes since last deploy. And find what was changed.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you can do is your last release number will have one of those 8-digit git, what do they call them? The timestamps. But not a hash. It's like a unique point in time in Git, and your new one will also have, and there is a git command that you can run to say, show me stuff that's changed. If you could write something to parse that kind of delta back into what PBIX is, you could produce an intelligent filter then. And if anybody does that, I will, and kind of gives me the IP, I will buy you an Xbox, right?
All right, I'm going to start working on it, Bob.
Yeah.
So be ready. Okay, let's just got a few other bits and pieces. So we had a good question from Daniel Alexander. Hello, Daniel. Talking about, so I don't think you've mentioned it, but he says, could we check the report into source control as a pbit file, a Power BI template, because that will remove the data sources. And if you did that, would that affect the deployment in any way?
Yes, so there's a few things on that. Right, one is so actually Alex Whittles actually has a blog on exactly that. Right, he experimented with that. Right, the reason that we didn't do that is templates were designed for something different than deployments. Right, they were designed to develop like an app that you could ship to customers. Right, and it also, developers are lazy. Right. And it means you've got to add a lot of processes, because you've got to say to a developer, every time you do a check-in, I want you to save the PBIX as a PBIT, and when you want to rework on it, create a new PBIX from the PBIT, right? So it's something that you could get to work, but I didn't like the extra process that was involved.
So you're moving the automation to the developers instead of the pipeline.
Exactly. Now, if it could all be done under PowerShell, and it could all be fully automated and just, it all happened invisibly, I'll be, yeah, that's cool. But the fact that developers had to manually click buttons in order to do it, I was like, that kind of defeats the purpose of the automated pipeline.
Cool. I have a sort of a question about deployment, which may be complete nonsense, but this whole question about being concerned with the PBIX file pushing a big load of data up to the server in an enterprise, is that really a problem, because you'll usually be using data flows, or is there still an issue with caching data within the PBIX file?
Yeah, I mean, even if you're using a data flow, I mean, that's only a data source, right? It's still got to the actual PBX is still going to import it, right?
Right. Okay.
So it depends on your type of project, though, which is correct. For example, we have a lot of projects that are using analysis services, right? In which case, the kind of data is in the analysis services, right? So in which case, it's no problem at all, right? So if you are using analysis services, and if you've split your project into a model and a report, your report projects won't really get any bloat. I mean, they'd be like, you know, a few hundred K, right? So they're fine. It's your model kind of data set, which is going to give you the bloat, you know? So there are ways of doing it. One interesting way that I looked at is when I read about other vendors' implementations of Git, now not the Microsoft, they had implemented an external blob store where you could specify like an Azure blob store and said, store any large objects over there and don't store more than X versions. But I don't think that the Azure repos was compatible with external blob stores yet.
Okay, cool.
Now, one last thing, I've just done that kind of test we said that they would do. On this browser, I have a premium workspace, which I called AdventureWorks Dev, I think, yeah. And I did a user called Azure One, who's only a pro user. And we were going to see if they could see the workspace.
So we've had a few people in chat that seems to think it won't work. So let's see if they really are the experts that they...
Yes.
And it looks like they are.
Yes. Anyone in chat who said there's no way that's going to work? Yes. That looks to be true, as you can see on screen.
Do they win an Xbox as well?
Yeah. No. As I want some code for that Xbox, right?
Okay, fair enough.
No. So yeah. So
I think we have time for one last of the questions. And that is on a totally different subject.
Yeah.
Are you able to assign users to role-level security roles as a part of the pipeline? And that would be not the full Azure pipeline, but that is the Power BI pipeline. Or would that still need to be done manually after deployment has completed?
Yeah, so we have found that still has to be done manually, and we've also found, like, excluding ALM and pipelines, we haven't found a way to automatically set role memberships, right, through any API, right? So yeah, it would have to be done manually. But the good news is, if you've got so say for example, I've got a data set here, right, and I go into the security now. So they moved it to Power BI desktop. But anyway, if I set the membership, right, and I add the members, then that's persistent, right? So it's kind of a once-off task. But if you delete the kind of data set, you then got to set them all up, which is really annoying. Like in the analysis services world, we would have, you know, a PowerShell or an XML script that per environment would do all the mappings. Say, well, this role is this security group. We haven't found a way to automate that in the Power BI world yet.
But it's anyway once set up and never change again.
Yeah, until
Hopefully.
You accidentally, yeah. I mean, if you completely deleted the kind of data set and republished it, well, yeah, then it'd get a different GUID and it'll lose all its persistent settings. So from that point of view, so from an ALM point of view, it's nice to have something that could start from scratch, you know, which it can't.
Well, cool. I think that concludes the question session and the session for tonight. I would say thanks for joining us to everybody, and a big thanks to Bob.
Thank you very much.